Hello and welcome back to Rage Gaming. It's time to talk Necromancer. With the preseason truly in its final days now, it's time to talk about the builds, to do a sort of final ranking of how Necromancer has shaped up in the true endgame. By the time you've reached 90 plus or up to 100, and the majority of everything is unlocked, including your uniques and ideal aspects. Overall, I find Necromancer extremely strong, successfully taking down Uber Lilith in record speeds, and of course tier 100s with multiple builds. We have done well, if you don't mind being an off-brand mage, that is. But hey, we're a stronger class than Sorceress, so there's that. As a heads up, you can find a video guide on all the builds I'm going to talk about today on the channel or linked in the description. But what are the top 5 builds for Necromancer? Let's get into it. Starting from the bottom, number 5, it's very clearly the Blood builds. It's funny because Blood builds hit an all-time high with patch 1.0.3 with major buffs to its core mechanics. Hemorrhage was buffed to deal better damage and generate more essence, our main basic of choice. Rathma's Vigor, our key passive, that had its overpower proc requirement of 15 seconds reduced to 12, which is big. They buffed other things like Fast Blood, Aspect, and the Corpse Tendrils with the Blight version, generating even more Blood Orbs. And finally, Bloodlance was buffed again, this time with Supernatural Bloodlance, generating its guaranteed overpower at 6 casts instead of 8. So after testing both Surge and Bloodlance builds, I came to the conclusion that they're both just too weak to really compete in the meta. No matter which way you swing it, overpower as a damage modifier is too limited. They're clearly afraid it'll be too strong if they let it get the full benefits of both crit and vulnerability, but it's a shame because its current state and version is overly capped on power. Overpower itself is far from a consistent form of damage, even with the blood builds that give you 2 ways to get it. The problem here, I think, is that you're working so hard to make overpower work, to make it stronger, to center everything around it, to make it hit as hard as possible, and the reward is just not worth all that commitment. I will say the survivability of the build is really good, all the healing and fortifying, potential barriers too, it's great, and in fact you can push high tiers because of that. The playstyle is really unique, building up your overpowers and intentionally using it to AoE with Hemorrhage or smash with Bloodlance or Surges at specific times. I really like it, but it is overly weak and awkward for what you get. Let's also acknowledge for a moment that Bloodlance was nerfed into oblivion. A literal joke, worthless, all because of a game-breaking bug with the Lance animation, causing players to go out of bounds, so they've nerfed it to be so terrible that no one's going to deal with that bug anymore. Apparently in Season 1 it's going to be fixed and back to normal at some point, but back to normal means still fairly weak. Both Surge and Lance work, but between the two I think Surge is still the better pick just because it's a reliable AoE, where Lance sometimes AoEs, but most often it just doesn't, even when you're fully committing to the aspect that helps that happen. So Lance, like Overpower itself, is too unreliable in its current state, even if it does slap when it works rarely. Next up at number 4, I think it's time to talk Minion Necromancer. Straight to the point on this, Minion Necromancer is not bad. It's playable, it works, and you can do well with it. However, I'm speaking at like the high levels when you're like 90 plus, at the point where you're able to get the massive amount of Paragon related powers that it demands. Be that the legendary nodes that are all amazing, the glyphs where you have so much choice that you can't actually get everything you want, or the really important rare nodes in fact that keep you and your minions alive and strong. Way too little of these important details are actually found on your gear and specifically your skill tree, where hey, you could actually get the minion builds going before Mega Endgame. Anyway, there's 2 types of minion builds that seem to work best in my opinion. First is the Shadow Blight focused build that relies a lot on Corpse Explosion as a main source of damage. The minions come in to help spread shadow damage and CC and also distract enemies, but you're still benefiting from the huge golem sacrifice that is the 30% times crit. The build is essentially a worse version of the Shadowmist build though, which is a mega issue for many. You're sort of playing a minion Necromancer, but really you're playing Shadowmist without everything you want in that build. Second then is the full minion build, the true summoner, using all the skeletons and the golem. Here the golem is hitting hard, basically never dying, and acts as a second way to spread your shadow version of Bone Storm. The extra Bone Storm helps you generate an even stronger shield via the Shielding Storm aspect, and mixed with Corpse Tendrils and the Golem Slam, you do have a lot of hard CC and stun. Your DPS becomes much more build up and spend however though, where you set things up, manage your buffs and debuffs, group enemies up with the Tendrils, and then slam and smash finally. But if you don't have Bone Storm active, your damage will fall off into oblivion. But when you do have it, which is most of the time, you are respectably strong and very tanky indeed. But there's simply no room for Blood Mist in the build because your skill slots are all taken up, leaving you vulnerable, mega vulnerable in fact, in the periods where Bone Storm is down. Between the two, I think Shadow Crit and the Corpse Explosion barely minion build is stronger because it's a lot more consistent. And as this is not a feedback video, I will only say that Minion Necromancer needs to be reworked, in my opinion, with how minions are summoned, their aspects, and their paragon. A lot of the key stuff going into the skill tree, I think that's what should happen. Moving on, we have number 3. Bone Spirit builds. As I just explained, the Golem minion build is decent and it's all about setting up and then smashing. But the thing is, Bone Spirit does the same thing, only way harder. We're talking tens of millions of damage in a single hit, which lands in AoE. It'll one-shot bosses, let alone a pack of enemies, easily. It hits the hardest out of everything a Necromancer can do in terms of a single hit. The issue and downside here is the slow nature of the build. You have to spend all of your essence to cast a single Bone Spirit, which means you must set it up properly to use it and make it worth using. This means you're preparing packs of enemies every time instead of blasting through and moving efficiently and quickly. After you Bone Spirit though, you're also going to be quickly working to recover your essence to get to the next Bone Spirit as soon as possible. There is indeed a way to improve its clear times though, the unique chest piece which allows for a weaker Bone Spirit after you pick up Blood Orbs, but it costs no essence so it's entirely for free. Its damage is based on your current life percentage, which doesn't mean it's weak, it's just not as strong as your main one. And since you can generate a ton of Blood Orbs, as you do say Corpse Tendrils, then wander around picking them up, you can generate like multiple 2 or 3 Bone Spirits for 0 essence. So yeah, that helps with your mob clear obviously, but it's at the cost of major survivability of having a normal chest with 4 defensive powerful affixes, let alone an aspect. The safer option then is to use a normal chest piece and just ignore the unique, which actually kind of works for higher tier content like higher tier dungeons where you're playing slow and cautious anyway. The Bone Spirit clear is slow because you need to generate essence and wait for cooldowns and stop and set up fights properly, which is pretty good for pushing nightmare tiers. But even if the damage is great and there's interesting details to the build, it does not compete with the pace and power of the next 2 builds. At number 2 for Necromancer in our current preseason endgame is very clearly Shadowmist, a brilliant build concept in which you reset the cooldown of Blood Mist through lots of lucky hit, resulting in Decrepify dropping your cooldown of Blood Mist next to 0. So you've got a massive amount of uptime in the mist, making you completely immune to CC and all damage. Combine that with Shadow damage to provide Shadow Blight, the key passive that deals damage over time, you actually can deal a lot of damage while totally immune to it yourself. This concept was how the build's creator, Necobon, was able to clear a tier 100 as a Necromancer like a month ago in what seemed to be the first Necromancer to do it, though that is unconfirmed to my knowledge. Either way, the build simply works for that concept, but there's various ways to push it in power, focusing a lot less on damage reduction or avoidance, but working in crit, stacking damage into the build, spreading your Shadow Blight through Corpse Explosions, Bone Storm, and even Sever if you're running that for the full burst version that I put together. Sever itself, by the way, does have its own build and would make it onto this list as its own build, probably around say Minion Necromancer level, but since I work it into both my Shadowmist build and my Minion build, I figured it's not worth it as a mid-tier level build anyway. Either way, Shadowmist can be modified to be much more about a speed clear than tier pushing, with higher damage over time and much better burst at that. In that version where it's got much better damage, it's still like ultra survivable with its massive uptime on Blood Mist, making for an incredible build, one of the strongest conceptually. However, you know what I'm about to say. It doesn't compete with Bone Spear because, you know, not many builds in the entire game do. The fastest solo Uber Lilith kill times with its own incredible tier 100 clear at great pace. It's also the best build for leveling, hands down for a Necromancer due to its early power spikes, and it just destroys Nightmare Dungeon speed clears as well for long-term leveling because, you know, everything's dying instantly. Bone Spear itself is spreading the vulnerability, which is crazy. The main damaging ability being the thing that generates vulnerability is not. And of course, it's critting for huge numbers. And it's even generating the resource you need for it, essence, at a massive rate because you generate essence through hitting vulnerable targets. It's so good on paper, and obviously in play, it's ridiculous. The king of various categories, not only for Necromancer, but even some for all classes. Bone Spear is why Necromancer stands at the top, or at very least near the top, of all classes overall. All of that, and it benefits from things like Bone Storm, Decrepify, Blood Mist, and more, which is what makes other Necromancer builds good in the first place. So it's crazy good, and I'm thinking perhaps in Season 1 it might see a nasty nerf. If they were to do that, that. I hope they do it without ruining Necromancer as a whole. We're going to have to wait and see on that, because most builds are heavily relying on Corpse Tendrils, Bone Storm, and of course Decrepify. So if they were to nerf these things, they would be nerfing all Necromancer, not just Bone Spear. But there you have it, my overview of the top Necromancer builds in the current pre-season meta. Again, you can find all of the builds as video guides by me on the channel right now, or linked in the video description. I'm really looking forward to seeing how things shape up and change in Season 1 for variety, and also maybe how they balance things. Maybe the Blood builds will actually have any contests in the meta. Maybe Minion builds will finally be balanced to actually work sooner. Or maybe that's all just wishful thinking. We'll soon know. The balance patch is dropping very soon on the 18th. But for now, I've been Hollow, you've been you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.